Well, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, from wherever in the world you may be joining us. My name is Jeroen de Wolf. I am the director of the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies, also the director of Berkeley's Dutch Studies program. I would like to welcome all of you to today's event, an event that is organized in cooperation with the UC Berkeley Department of History, as well as Flanders in the USA, the representation of the region of Flanders to the United States, an organization that has been very important as an ally of our Dutch Studies program here in Berkeley. This event takes place in connection with the Peter Paul Rubens Chair, which is a rotating visiting professorship here at the University of California, Berkeley, that is sponsored by the government of the region of Flanders in Belgium. It allows us to annually bring a visiting professor from a Flemish university to Berkeley to teach a course on the Berkeley campus and to also give a public lecture. Allow me to briefly then use this opportunity to thank my predecessor, the Emeritus Queen Beatrix Professor Johan Snapper, who created this visiting professorship, and also to my colleague in the Department of History, Professor Jan de Vries, who over the years has been a very strong ally in support of the Rubens Chair, as well as to my former professor from Ghent University, Professor Walter Prevenier, who for many years has been our representative of the Rubens Chair in Flanders. Let me then welcome this year's Peter Paul Rubens visiting professor, Bert De Munck, who is a professor of history at the University of Antwerp. And let me briefly say a few words about today's speaker. What I find fascinating about today's speaker is that Bert De Munck did not have a traditional pathway that led him to university. In fact, he started his career as an auto mechanic before completing his education and moving on towards a splendid academic career. Bert De Munck is currently a full professor at the Department of History at the University of Antwerp. He's also member of the Center for Urban History in Antwerp and the director of the Interdisciplinary Urban Studies Institute and the International Scientific Research Committee entitled Urban Agency, the historical fabrication of the city as an object of study. His research concentrates on early modern cities, in particular craft, guilds and civil society, poor relief and mutual aid, work and knowledge, and the repertoires of evaluation regarding skills and products. His best-known book is a publication entitled Guilds, Labor and the Urban Body Politic, Fabricating Community in the Southern Netherlands, 1300 until 1800, a book that was published by Routledge in 2018. Professor De Munck prepared for us a presentation that will take about 35-40 minutes, and following the presentation we will have a chance for conversation with Professor De Munck, asking him some follow-up questions. So during his presentation, all of you in the audience, you're all invited to post questions in the chat function on Zoom, and I will be happy to pass on a selection of your questions to Professor De Munck during the Q&A after his presentation. But for now, please relax and enjoy the presentation that Professor De Munck prepared for us today, a presentation entitled Craftsmanship and Governmentality, the Value of Artisanal Skills in the Renaissance and the Modern City. So Bert, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks everybody who is present here. Good morning or good evening to everybody. I would like to begin my lecture with actually 4 related observations. And the first one is that cities are seen today as engines of economic innovation. And this goes back to a long tradition, actually, in which cities are considered to be the cradle of modernity, even civilization. And today we live in a knowledge economy, and crucial knowledge is indeed developed in cities. But perhaps this quote, and now my PowerPoint doesn't move. I had a quote. Yes, okay. I was saying this quote, nevertheless, is perhaps a bit exaggerated. I'm not going to read the quotes aloud. I have a lot of quotes with me, but I'm going to summarize them. And the summary of this one is that for Edward Glaser, which is an economist from Harvard, new thinking is consistently actually produced in cities. Second observation. The second observation is that the knowledge involved in the knowledge economy is considered to be mainly developed by what Richard Florida has called the creative class. All growth is expected from an elite of highly educated economic actors who introduce new products, set new trends, and so on. And they succeed in doing so in part thanks to their education, but also thanks to their capacity to be creative. And this is in turn related to social attitudes and cultural tastes. Innovation, in my view, is normative. And this leads me to a third observation. The normativity involved in creativity and innovation leads to the idea that the capacity to be innovative is situated today in one's head and not in one's hands or one's body. And this can be illustrated with another quote, one from Richard Florida himself, about the creative class. Fourthly, in social sciences such as urban studies and human geography, there is a consensus now that there is a new underclass emerging, especially in cities. A class of people who do the unattractive jobs, such as cleaning, carrying packages around, and the low-paid jobs in caretaking. These people do not succeed in getting in higher education, and they apparently lack the capacity to be an engine of growth. This is what geographer Jamie Peck writes about them. In summary, they are not part of the script of the knowledge economy, and they fail to be creative. And this is related. So in the following 35 minutes, I will try to unpack the relationship between these observations from an historical perspective. What is seen as innovative and valuable today is different from what was seen as innovative or creative 100 years ago, let alone 500 years ago. Yet in most cases, we assume that innovation takes place in cities. Richard Florida, among others, sees a link between the urban context and creativity. For Florida, the city is, as it were, the natural habitat of the creative class. And he has actually advised urban policymakers all over the world on how to design the city in such a way that they accommodate the creative class, that the creative class would settle there, that they would feel good there, that they would feel at home there. And this implies actually that our conception of innovation and creativity is connected to our conception of the ideal city. And this was not different in the past either. Just look at this quote from the early 15th century from a eulogy of the city of Florence by the humanist Leonardo Bruni. According to Bruni too, there was a connection between the talents and qualities of the inhabitants of Florence and the nature and character of the conception of the city itself. And of course, it is not clear in this quotation which inhabitants Florida is referring to. But we can safely assume that, just as is the case with Florida, it is about an urban elite, about those people who are assumed to make the city great and famous. And with respect to the Renaissance, we do not only have to think then of urban patricians or the mercantile elites who ran the city, but also of the artists and architects who literally shaped the city and designed the products that made the city prosper, economically as well as culturally. Of course, we are all familiar with the canonized Renaissance artists whose works we can admire all over the world to this day. These are the people which resemble Florida's creative class the most. They are skillful, first of all, but they are also educated, and their cultural repertoires are in tune with the tastes of the upper classes. As designers, they are therefore also able to introduce new products and trends because they are familiar with the elite's frames of reference. However, the Renaissance city also employed many common craftsmen who have not made it into the art history books and who were nevertheless important in the economic life of the city. How did they fare in this context? Should they also be seen as a late medieval underclass, perhaps, or is there more to it? With regard to the late medieval cities in the Low Countries, leading economic historians and social historians have argued that the backbone of the urban economy was not artists, but artisans, craftsmen. And craftsmen, who were moreover organized in guilds very often, were also crucial to the social and cultural life of the city. Their guilds were like the key vehicles for access to social, cultural, and political participation. So we might ask, what was the relationship between the nature of these early modern cities in the Low Countries and the talents and skills of craftsmen during the Renaissance? In a recent book chapter on the South German city of Nuremberg, and the book depicted here now, Hannah Murphy has shown that the communal and the civic characteristics of the city were deeply entangled with artisanal epistemologies. According to Murphy, artisanal knowledge was profoundly entangled with the way in which the city was imagined and conceived. Specifically, Murphy brings to the fore a civic epistemology in which not individual artistic excellence was central, but collaboration and communal forms of craftsmanship. In late medieval Nuremberg, it was not artistic talent that was the basic for civic identity, but artisanal ways of making, craftsmanship. And this brings me to my own work on the southern Netherlands, roughly present-day Belgium. I have also tried to expose the connection between the nature and value of artisanal knowledge on the one hand, and the city as a social, political, and ideological reality on the other. And I have moreover tried to understand that what the long-term transformations were in this respect. And in the rest of the lecture, I will try to summarize what my findings are. And they are also basically summarized in the book, which has already mentioned by you. I argue first that the late medieval or Renaissance city in the Low Countries, that there was a strong connection between an artisanal kind of epistemology and a specific conception of the city. And secondly, that the conception of both skills and knowledge and the city transformed in the long run. And to be sure, the late medieval connection between craftsmanship and the city was not self-evident. It was the outcome of conflict and social struggle. My case study is important precisely because artisans were relatively powerful there in most cities. On the one hand, craftsmen dominated the guilds there instead of merchants, like as was the case in Italy or the Northern Netherlands. And on the other hand, the guilds had a lot of power too. And the power resulted from late medieval urban revolts, which they had managed to win very often, and in which they had managed to gain a share of political power. The representatives of guilds were often part of the urban governing bodies. However, the crux of the matter is, my point is that this is not simply about political, military, or even economic factors, as could be deduced from images like this one. In fact, it is, in my view, also about cultural and epistemological issues. I try to write the history of power and the struggle for hegemony between different groups with attention to its epistemological dimension. I try to see the struggle for the right of the city as partly a struggle for the recognition of a certain kind of knowledge and epistemology, or ingenuity, as they called it in the Renaissance. And the struggle was subject to important transformations between the 15th and the 18th century, which in my view is the period in which artisanal epistemologies gave way to modern forms, in which artists and eventually Florida's creative class prevailed. In these modern forms, to start with these, the mind is indeed seen as superior to the hand. Innovation springs from the minds of a creative elite. You will find a good representation of that already in the ideas of Adam Smith. As most of you know, Adam Smith, the 18th century economist, was very much opposed to the so-called privileges of the guilds. And in this quote, he argues actually that the long learning terms, apprenticeship terms prescribed by the guilds are unnecessary. And many historians have interpreted this purely as a plea for the free market, for deregulation. But there is also a judgment about knowledge and skills in the quote. The ability, in Smith's terms, the ingenuity to design new products and production processes is reserved for an elite of economic and cultural actors, while the majority of craftspeople are reduced to mere mechanics, as they call it at the time, mechanics who only make the products designed by others. And for us, this might even seem obvious. This is the situation we are, in a way, familiar with. The situation in which artists, designers, and other inventors are more important than the performers. The craftsmen themselves, however, obviously perhaps, had a different view. This is a quote from around 1400 from a dialogue written by a humanist, the humanist Cusanus, in which a wooden spoon maker defends the importance of his craft against the claims for superiority of artists. At that time, artists increasingly distinguished themselves from what they called mere mechanics, and they increasingly claimed to have superior skills and talents. But according to the spoon maker, it is not artists who are superior, but craftsmen. And he argues that this is the case because artisans do not need a model to create something. Just as God did not have a model when he created the world. For the sake of clarity, God's creativity is called infinite art here in this quote. And according to Cusanus, craftsmen approached God's infinite art more than did artists and architects, because in contrast to the latter, unlike God, they didn't need a model. So the question now is, how did we go from one vision to another, from Cusanus to Smith? And how is this related to the conception of the city? Let us first look at how artisans first prevailed and succeeded in being recognized as political actors. This recognition is the result of military and political victories. This image, again, just as a reminder of that, you can see on the right-hand upper side, guild banners waving. And political historians have described actually how guilds prevailed in some of these revolts and were, as a result, recognized as members of the urban body politic. The metaphor of the body is important here because it was very pervasive in how the city was imagined. I come back to that later. After the victories of the guilds, the members of the guilds were considered political actors. They were incorporated. They became part of the city as a political body. And thus they became a political actor because of their membership of the guild. But because just to become a political actor, to become an urban citizen, they had to become member of the guild. The acquisition of mastership, becoming member of the guild, coincided actually with the, or was conditional on the acquisition of urban citizenship. It was two sides of the same coin. But here, the connection with knowledge becomes visible as well, because membership of the guild was in turn contingent on finishing an apprenticeship term. You had to have learned the trade in order to become a political actor. You had to have demonstrated that you could do the craft with a master test. So for craftsmen, urban citizenship was related to a certain kind of knowledge. And in my view, the importance of this can hardly be overestimated. Before, craftsmen were seen as even unworthy of being a political actor altogether. They were simply not considered rational enough for that. In political thinking, they were even seen as part of the realm of nature rather than of politics, and therefore incapable of acting rationally, because rationality implied being part of the political or the artificial sphere, as they also call it. And the fact that artisans succeeded in becoming part of the political sphere in this period may have been due to epistemological transformations taking place in the same period, which is between the late 14th and the 16th century. At the same time as the artisans finally gained access to the political, the gap between nature and artifice narrowed as well. This is at least argued by an historian of science, Pamela Long, in her book, Artisan Practitioners and the Rise of the New Sciences. She argues that on the one hand, artists and artisans imitated the perfection of nature better and better. And on the other hand, nature experienced a first phase of disenchantment. And in that process, artisans were implicated because artisans in particular tried to understand in a way nature through experiment and observation. So they were instrumental in closing the gap between nature and the political or artifice. So fundamental changes in the political status of craftsmen chronologically coincided with epistemological changes that had an impact on the value of craft knowledge. The next step, my next step then, is to understand the epistemology involved a bit better. At the most superficial level, the knowledge involved was of course different for all crafts. But at the same time, physical experience and trial and error were central to every craft. Learning was done through a process of repeated dealing with raw materials, which is in a way, you could say, dealing with nature. And this dealing with nature had a clear political dimension shared by most crafts. Because what ultimately mattered for crafts, or at least for their guilds, was not the virtuosity with which you could make certain products, but reliability, which is a political virtue. An apprenticeship taught you to become a reliable craftsman, and at the same time, a good citizen. But the reliability of the craftsman, which was guaranteed by his political status, was related to the value attached to nature, which brings us again in the epistemological sphere. These two elements, the importance of nature and political status, they came together actually in the quality marks that guild-based masters used as craftsmen. And you see an example here. This is a quality mark hammered on a tin plate in Antwerp in the 18th century. It communicated to the customer that the plate was made by a guild-based master. The initials are at the bottom. His initials are at the bottom. And that it communicated that the plate was made by a guild-based master, and that it therefore guaranteed a certain quality, a minimum quality. In this case, a certain alloy. Every product that was put on the market had to have such a hallmark, and for the guilds. And the hallmarks did not guarantee, as I said, the virtuosity with which the product was made, but rather an invisible quality, the intrinsic value of the raw materials used. It guaranteed that the right fat skin had been used by shoemakers, the right type of wood by cabinet makers, that the silver was of the right alloy with silversmiths, and so on. It was always about intrinsic value. And social and economic historians could reduce this perhaps to rent-seeking ambitions or to a matter of efficiency, because it either also justified the guild's monopolies and their privileges, and it was instrumental in creating market transparency, and so on. But the importance of the intrinsic value of the raw materials can also be related to the epistemological context. In her book, The Body of the Artisan, another historian of science and an art historian, Pamela Smith, argues that early modern artists and artisans maintained a specific relationship with materiality before the 18th century. Matter was not something dead and passive for this group. Smith explains this with reference to 16th century scientists like Paracelsus. For Paracelsus, science was not simply situated in the mind of the observing scientist. No, science was partly inherent in matter itself. And this is related to the religious context because God's wisdom is situated in matter. In a way, God has left his signature there when he created the world. So in this view, the value of an artifact produced by skilled hands of craftsmen, results not only from the skills and the dexterity of the artisans, but rather from a kind of a fusion between, on the one hand, the divine qualities of matter, and on the other hand, the inspired mind of the soul, you should rather say, the soul of the artisan. And people who are familiar with the history of knowledge will notice that this is based on a Foucauldian view of the history of knowledge. And more specifically on Michel Foucault's Renaissance episteme. In that episteme, things as well as words give access to truth because of God's immanence. Objects gave access to God's wisdom and hence to the truth because God was immanent in them. So you could say that in this period, craftsmen could be seen as a kind of knowledge workers, people with access to knowledge, to the truth even, because they dealt with artifacts, because they dealt with raw materials. And this is what disappears in the course of the early modern period. And the process can again be described through changes in the valuation of skills as well as changes in the conception of the city. Let me first stick to the skills and start with the skills. As mentioned before, by the 18th century, there was a dichotomy between designing and executing and between the mind and the hand. Craftsmen were no longer seen as capable of designing and innovating. Some has seen this as a process of de-skilling due to technological changes, as can be demonstrated by this quote, also from Adam Smith, in which artisans are actually reduced to a factor of production. So you could see this as a process of proletarianization as well, but there is more than that. In the field of knowledge and at the crossroads of knowledge and the economy, the French historian Hélène Vérin has also referred to the process of what she called the reduction in art. And with this term, Vérin refers to the emergence of a practical science in which the routines of artisans were replaced by abstract principles and by systematization, the principles of abstraction and systematization of engineers and architects. And this started in the 16th century, according to Vérin, the period of the scientific revolution, in which the scientific revolution starts, at least. At the same time, in this very same period, the way in which products were valued transformed. More specifically, the importance of intrinsic value was declining in favor of the importance of novelty and fashionability. Hence, in other words, design became important. This is the period in which the phenomenon of fashion becomes into being, the 17th and 18th century. And it can hardly be a coincidence that this too coincided with an epistemological shift, as again described by Foucault. According to Foucault, around the middle of the 17th century, the so-called classical episteme replaced the Renaissance episteme just discussed. And in the new episteme, truth is man-made, produced in discourses and by building taxonomies. God's immanent or intrinsic truth is replaced by a representational system. And what happened in the economic sphere can be mapped on this almost entirely. Fashion is a system in which the value of the product is not intrinsic to the product, but the result of the place of the product in a taxonomy of products. Just as in the representational system of Foucault, the value and meaning of words is contingent on their place in a taxonomy of signifiers. So in concrete terms, the guild's collective hallmarks were in the long run, in the 18th and 19th centuries, typically replaced with discourses on product quality and on trade cards and in advertisements and in catalogs and on leaflets and so on. And at the same time, the artisans lost their political power again. On the surface, this is the result of complex processes of oligarchization and state formation, but knowledge here as well was involved. And I can illustrate this with a small anecdote from around the middle of the 17th century in Antwerp. At the occasion of discussions between the guilds and the Antwerp municipality, the Antwerp guilds urged the urban magistracy to grant them access to their charters, to the bowl of charters, as they called it. And this was in order to settle a dispute about their rights and privileges. But access to their charters was denied to them. And the argument was that the masters, especially the masters of the smaller subaltern guilds, the argument was that they would misread and misinterpret the charters. So by the mid-17th century, apparently, small guild-based masters were considered unable to even understand their own privileges, which were essentially about the relationship between their value as artisans and their political status. So the long-term history, the long-term political history is not exhausted with reference to processes of, or economic history, to processes of proletarianization, state formation, and oligarchization. And this is all the more the case because in the meantime, the conception of the city transformed as well. During the Renaissance, cities were still seen as relatively autonomous political bodies. In the course of the early modern period, however, this autonomy was increasingly eroded, mainly by state formation processes. And this happened most rapidly in highly centralized states such as England, France, and Spain, but in regions such as the southern Low Countries as well, in which where cities traditionally had a lot of power and a lot of autonomy. In these regions as well, centrally run bureaucracies gradually gained the upper hand. And this process was partly responsible for the erosion of the crafts guild's privileges, because these were strictly based on an urban-rural distinction. Previously, the urban guild-based craftsmen often had the exclusive right to produce a certain type of products, but gradually, non-guild-based or countryside entrepreneurs were allowed to produce similar products. As a result of which, actually, the mandatory apprenticeship term, which regulated access to the privilege, was fundamentally losing its meaning. And here as well, you can already guess, this has an epistemological and religious dimension, in my view. In an eye-opening article of about early modern Lyon from the 1980s already, Natalie Zeman-Davis has pointed to the impact of religion on the experience and perception of the city. Catholic rituals like processions, according to Davis, implied the city as a material reality. For instance, in Catholic processions, because Catholic processions attributed a central role to the rivers running through the city, the bridges, the surrounding hills, and so forth. But in contrast to that, Protestants had an attitude in which the city was not only purified from Catholic images and relics, but was more abstracted altogether. As an extension to the idea that for Protestants, the sacred could not be present in a thing, like in a relic, for instance, the streets they paraded with while singing their psalms had lost their sacred sense too. They were reduced to avenues which facilitated the communication of their religious messages. And following Davis, Protestants would thus have facilitated the transformation of the city into a permanent market of sorts, which was contrary to the artisans' guilds, which defended a closed city of sorts, a closed political body. So the conception of the city gradually changed from a closed body to an open infrastructure focused on circulation. Following the political scientist Richard Sennett, this too may have happened under the influence of scientific and epistemological developments. In this book, also already a few decades old, the book Flesh and Stone, Sennett pointed out that the human circulatory system, the circulation of blood in the human body, was discovered in the very same period. And if you ask me, it is again Michel Foucault who has best put the finger on the conceptual link between the political and the epistemological in this period. Foucault had also noticed the connection between state formation processes and the changing conception of the city as a political body. As you can see here in this quote. But beyond that, his work allows also to really bridge the gap between the urban and the epistemological. And the concept which allows us to do that, I think, is the concept of governmentality. Governmentality is a concept which refers to what Foucault and those who have interpreted his work have called the art of governance, or also the rationality of governance. It refers to the set of discourses and practices that underpin and shape political action and governance in the broad sense. And just as in his work on the archaeology of knowledge, Foucault saw a number of historical fault lines in this respect. And the most important fault line is, again, the one appearing roughly after the mid-17th century. What gradually emerges there is not only economic thought, a new economic thinking, or the rationality of the state. What emerges there, according to Foucault, is a type of governance that no longer focuses on the relationship between sovereign and subject. The focus on the direct relationship between prince and subject is actually replaced with the interaction between an administrative and bureaucratic apparatus on the one hand, and the population, a population in a territory on the other hand. And this new of government governance came about to an extent through the development of new forms of knowledge too. Whereas the decision of a feudal sovereign or a prince were based actually upon his virtue and his goodness and his rationality, the decisions of the modern state are based on figures, statistics, proto-statistics, figures on mortality, fertility, productivity, balance of trade, and so forth. And this can again be linked to my artisans. And here I come to my conclusion. This new type of governance, in this new type of governance, a new, fundamentally new relationship to artisans is developed as well. A central notion in the modern rationality of governance was the notion of productivity. This was one of the things which was represented with new types of statistics. Productivity. The new type of governance was related to a new relationship between labor and the Commonwealth. While the city merged into a larger bureaucratic entity, a totally different value was placed on labor actually in the governmental sphere. And this was paradoxical because labor, including manual labor, became in a way more highly valued in this process. While trade had been the basis of prosperity for ages, henceforth, this was actually labor, according to the theories. But at the same time, artisans were reduced to a kind of robots. The enlightened philosopher Denis Diderot even used the term automatons in his famous encyclopedia. Automatons, artisans as robots. And this is how pin making was depicted in the encyclopedia. Pin making was one of the most famous examples used in the work of Adam Smith in his work on the wealth of nations. And when you see how pin makers are depicted in the encyclopedia, you could say that they are hardly visible anymore. They are in a way similar to machines and a type of robots. So the point is that labor became more important in a way, but at the same time, hands-on skills became disconnected from knowledge and disconnected from a political status. Artisans were reduced to a factor of production, an element in a statistic. They were no longer political actors, no longer actors with ingenuity, no longer actors with knowledge, which could have also an economic and politically added value. Their mental capacity no longer mattered, not even economically. And in the words of a Smith scholar, workers, this quote I'm going to read aloud in the words of a Smith scholar, workers, not citizens, are the inhabitants of the new era, the burgeoning industrial age, and the workplace, not the agora, is their stage. And I think I can conclude with this because I think this is basically where the history of the 19th century begins. The 19th century, in my view, can be seen to a large degree as a new era of struggles of artisans and handworkers to be recognized as political actors again, because they had lost that status in the 17th and the 18th century. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Bert. This was really a fascinating lecture with lots of very interesting new perspectives, and I see we already have a first question from Martin, but perhaps before we go to the questions, Bert, I can't resist kind of doing something very American, which is making a connection between your research and your biography, right? Because I started the presentation, I made a short reference to it, that you had kind of a different pathway towards academics. You started as a workman yourself and as an auto mechanic. Has this in a way shaped the way you do your research today? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's also a complicated one. I have actually been an apprentice myself. I dropped out of school at 15, and I went working and as an apprentice. But this was unrelated to the fact that I then did later, when I was 26, I started a PhD on apprenticeship. But this was actually a coincidence, because this was a project which I applied for and which was written by my supervisor, Hugo Soli. Because a lot of people think that there is a connection between me having been an apprentice myself and then having written a PhD on apprenticeship, but that was a coincidence. But I do think there is a connection between how I see apprenticeship and my experience on the shop floor. I think that there is a connection between that. And also, my view on cities, if you go back to the quote of Edward Glaser, with which I started, and which actually implies that civilization and every human progress thinkable comes from cities. I am also a farmer's son, so so this actually is also a bit in conflict with my identity as a farmer's son, because it's difficult to accept that every valuable human thing can only be originating in cities. So I think there's a connection between my social background and the way I look at knowledge, and cities. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this, Bert. Well, let me pass on then the question that Martin prepared for us. It's a very specific question. Let me read it for you. He refers to Simon Davis' idea of the Protestants opening up the city, and he said, it strikes me as far-fetched. Catholic France was reducing urban autonomy perhaps more than any other European country, and following your argument, this culminated in Haussmann's opening up Paris during the 19th century. It seems to me that you're overstating your point here, also because the German urban reformation was all about urban autonomy. How would you react to that?
Yeah, I can understand the hesitation, and it is of course something which is difficult or even impossible to establish in an empirical way, of course. If only because it's not a matter of attributing it then to Protestantism as such, or the Reformation as such. But I think it's one element in a range of elements which suggest that there are transformations in the broad cultural religious sphere, which are related to how the city is transforming in a political sense. But I don't want to imply that Protestantism is an isolated causal factor here. It's just a way of showing actually that there is an entanglement between religious, cultural, and political factors, and that the religious factor might have played a role also in economic and political transformations. But I fully understand the criticism, because it's really difficult to put the finger on it, and to substantiate it empirically.
Yeah. Bert, I see that we also have a question from a former Rubens professor, actually, Konrad van Kleinpoel from Hasselt University, who has two questions. Let me start with the first one. Was there also a role for the early universities in this blurring discourse between the mind and the hand? Was there, in other words, also innovation in the universities by artisans?
Yeah, that's a good question as well, and also a difficult one. I'm not an historian of knowledge which is too familiar with the history of universities, but you see in any case also discussions about the role of craftsmanship among people which have been very important in the scientific revolution in the 17th century, like Descartes, for example. Descartes has written about what you could call an artisanal epistemology as well.
Mm-hmm.
And he has tried to see a kind of a mathematical order underneath their work, for instance. He has tried to compare what he was looking for, the mathematical, the matrices of the world which he was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
He has tried to compare that with what the way in which artisans work. And he has tried to link that, finding that matrices with the capacity to distinguish details from patterns, for instance, which he considered something which artisans were particularly good in. But in his work in the 17th century is at the same time at the same time be used as an example of an evolution in the 17th century in which artisanal knowledge is gradually discarded as valuable, and in which the machine rather than the human body becomes important. And there's a shift in Descartes' work, for instance, in which the machine then becomes more important than the body of the artisan. And there are other examples of intellectuals, scientists, whether or not in the context of universities, which have tried to understand the value of artisanal knowledge in understanding nature in a broader sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I'm not sure whether I have answers to the question with this, but probably not. But that's the best I can do.
Thank you, Bert. I see that Koenraad also has a second question, but perhaps before we go to his second question, let me pass on a question from a PhD candidate who attended today's lecture, who's writing a dissertation in art history, studying the role of visual images of labor craftsmanship, and then asks the question, what would be your thoughts on the connections between the visual transmission of such images during the early modern period, a print, for example, and this epistemic transition?
That's also a good question, which I probably will fail to answer in an adequate way. I never studied the visual representation of labor in a systematic way, but there are historians which have done so in more systematically, like William Sewell, for instance, and they have often focused on things like the encyclopedia, and they have often come to the conclusion that idea of artisans being a kind of robots is becoming. They see an evolution in that direction also in the visual media. I have one small thing to add myself I have tried to add that one small dimension myself. If you look at visual images, I've tried to compare 16th century images with these more famous 18th century images. And then you see that also the context in which artisans are placed tends to transform. In my feeling, there was that in the 16th century, there was very often a connection to the city. You had open windows and open doors, and you had the shops in which these artisans were situated were always open. You could always very often see the city at the same time. So the connection with their citizenship was in a way visualized, and that tends to disappear as well in the 18th century. If you look at 18th century images, for instance, in the encyclopedia, it's very often the case that the artisans are situated in closed spaces, and that the city is no longer, or even any outside spaces has disappeared in a way. So that's what I could try to add to that. But I think the most important work there has been done by William Sewell and Cynthia Cupp as well, in a book in the 80s about labor in France, of Stephen Kaplan, there was a chapter on of Cynthia Cupp, which actually is similar to that. And there are some historians of science actually, which have also written on that from the perspective on the separation between mind and hand. That's mostly their intake then.
Yeah, thank you, Bert. Let me maybe go back to Koenraad van Kempel, who then also asked a second question about the guilds, right? And how the guilds could enhance innovation and not becoming corporative and protective. And it also leads a bit to a question I had myself, you know, that often we see guilds as conservative organizations, even if exclusive, right? Jews can become a member, for instance, things like that. So how much space was there in the guilds for innovation, for just being different? Can you elaborate a little bit on that as well, Bert?
Yeah, that's a huge discussion within historians studying guilds. There has been a shift from the idea that guilds were indeed, and Maarten Brakke has been an important historian in that respect. There has been a shift away from the idea that guilds were conservative and closed and so forth to the idea that a lot of their regulations could have been actually beneficial for economic efficiency as well. So one example is I have referred to one example, actually, the trademarks, the hallmarks. They can be seen as a way of excluding outsiders, and because you had to be a master to be able to be allowed to use the trademark. You had to have done the apprenticeship term, and you had to have done the mastership piece, and you had to have paid the fees and so forth. But of course, a quality mark also increases market transparency. It increases trust in the products and in the quality of the products. So from that perspective, from the perspective of well, it's actually also a new paradigm in the economic thinking from the perspective of new institutional economics. This is beneficial for economic efficiency in a way. So the debate is still ongoing, and my point on it is that it depends very often. Your view often depends, of course, from the vantage point of which you are addressing it. Because if you look at it from the perspective of efficiency and market transparency, yeah, then you will see. You will interpret these instruments as being conducive for that, but it doesn't exclude that at the same time it was about privileges and exclusion. So I think the one doesn't necessarily exclude the other. It is also a normative question, of course. But,
yeah. Bert, I see that we have 2 more minutes, so perhaps one last question. A question also coming from a former Rubens professor from Leuven, Violet Soen, who asks us, how would you assess the impact of gendered work relations on the shop floor, especially when you want to go beyond citing the widows of masters entering the guilds? That will be our closing questions.
Yeah, that's also a good question. I have managed to bypass gender issues almost entirely in my career so far. I'm not a good example in that respect, but there is a lot of work on guilds, which actually comes down to the idea that in the periods in which guilds become incorporated, become politically accepted, and hence that their value of their skills increases, that in that period, the period which I have been stressing in my lecture, that in that period it becomes more difficult for women to enter these high quality jobs, so that there is an exclusion mechanism which becomes more important exactly in this period. So you could say that if I say that the skills of artisans become more important in this period and become more highly valued in this period, that these are especially male skills, and that that women are increasingly excluded as a result of that. That would be my hypothesis.
Yeah, thank you, Bert. I see that other questions are coming in the chat. Unfortunately, we will have to close today's session. So let me perhaps in the chat paste the email address, Bert De Munck's email address, so you can then follow up with him directly on other questions. Let me thank our colleagues from the Department of History for co-sponsoring this event. Also a big thank you to Flanders in the USA for making this event possible. It was wonderful to have so many people in the audience with a connection to the Rubens Chair and to our Dutch Studies program, our Institute of European Studies here. I also saw my predecessor, Johan Snapper, attending, which was wonderful, Professor Prevenier, the two founding fathers, in a way, of this Rubens Chair. So all of this was wonderful to see. So a big thank you to all of you in the audience. I hope to see many of you in future events here at the Institute of European Studies and at our Dutch Studies program. But of course, the biggest thank of all goes to today's speaker, to Bert De Munck. Thank you, Bert, for a very interesting lecture.
Thank you.
And thank you for being such a wonderful Rubens Chair, representing the Flemish universities in a way at our university here in Berkeley, California.
And thanks for my part as well, of course. Thanks to everybody, the department, Jeroen, everybody who Jeroen has mentioned deserves my thanks as well. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Bert.
And feel free to contact me with additional questions and so forth.